Preface. Singletonville. It's almost impossible to overpay the truly extraordinary CEO, but the species is rare. Warren Buffett. You are what your record says you are. Bill Parcells. Success leaves traces. John Templeton. Who's the greatest CEO of the last 50 years? If you're like most people, the overwhelming likelihood is that you answered Jack Welch, and it's easy to see why. Welch ran General Electric, one of America's most iconic companies, for 20 years, from 1981 to 2001. GE's shareholders prospered mightily during Welch's tenure, with a compound annual return of 20.9%. If you had invested $1 in GE stock when Welch became CEO, that dollar would have been worth an extraordinary $48 when he turned the reins over to his successor, Jeff Immelt. Welch was both an active manager and a master corporate ambassador. He was legendarily peripatetic, traveling constantly to visit GE's far-flung operations, tirelessly grading managers and shuffling them between business units, and developing company-wide strategic initiatives with exotic-sounding names like Six Sigma and TQM. Welch had a lively, pugnacious personality and enjoyed his interactions with Wall Street and the business press. He was very comfortable in the limelight, and during his tenure at GE, he frequently appeared on the cover of Fortune magazine. Since his retirement, he has remained in the headlines with occasional controversial pronouncements on a variety of business topics, including the performance of his successor. He has also written 2 books of management advice with typically combative titles like Straight from the Gut. With this combination of notoriety and excellent returns, Welch has become a de facto gold standard for CEO performance, exemplifying a particular approach to management, one that emphasizes active oversight of operations, regular communication with Wall Street, and an intense focus on stock price. Is he, however, the greatest chief executive of the last 50 years? The answer is an emphatic no. To understand why, it's important to start by offering up a new, more precise way to measure CEO ability. CEOs, like professional athletes, compete in a highly quantitative field, and yet there is no single accepted metric for measuring their performance. No equivalent of ERA for baseball pitchers, or complication rate for surgeons, or goals against average for hockey goalies. The business press doesn't attempt to identify the top performers in any rigorous way. Instead, they generally focus on the largest, best-known companies, the Fortune 100, which is why the executives of those companies are so often found on the covers of the top business magazines. The metric that the press usually focuses on is growth in revenues and profits. It's the increase in a company's per-share value, however, not growth in sales or earnings or employees, that offers the ultimate barometer of a CEO's greatness. It's as if Sports Illustrated put only the tallest pitchers and widest goalies on its cover. In assessing performance, what matters isn't the absolute rate of return, but the return relative to peers and the market. You really only need to know 3 things to evaluate a CEO's greatness: the compound annual return to shareholders during his or her tenure, and the return over the same period for peer companies and for the broader market, usually measured by the S&P 500. Context matters greatly. Beginning and ending points can have an enormous impact, and Welch's tenure coincided almost exactly with the epic bull market that began in late 1982 and continued largely uninterrupted until early 2000. During this remarkable period, the S&P averaged a 14% annual return, roughly double its long-term average. It's one thing to deliver a 20% return over a period like that, and quite another to deliver it during a period that includes several severe bear markets. A baseball analogy helps to make this point. In the steroid-saturated era of the mid to late 1990s, 29 home runs was a pretty mediocre level of offensive output. The leaders consistently hit over 60. When Babe Ruth did it in 1919, however, he shattered the prior record, set in 1884, and changed baseball forever, ushering in the modern power-oriented game. Again, context matters. The other important element in evaluating a CEO's track record is performance relative to peers, and the best way to assess this is by comparing a CEO with a broad universe of peers. As in the game of duplicate bridge, companies competing within an industry are usually dealt similar hands, and the long-term differences between them, therefore, are more a factor of managerial ability than external forces. Let's look at an example from the mining industry. It's almost impossible to compare the performance of a gold mining company's CEO in 2011, when gold prices topped out at over $1,900 an ounce, with that of an executive operating in 2000, when prices languished at $400. CEOs in the gold industry cannot control the price of the underlying commodity. They must simply do the best job for shareholders, given the hand the market deals them, and in assessing performance, it's most useful to compare CEOs with other executives operating under the same conditions. When a CEO generates significantly better returns than both his peers and the market, he deserves to be called great. And by this definition, Welch, who outperformed the S&P by 3.3 times over his tenure at GE, was an undeniably great CEO. He wasn't even in the same zip code as Henry Singleton, however. Known today only to a small group of investors and cognoscenti, Henry Singleton was a remarkable man with an unusual background for a CEO. A world-class mathematician who enjoyed playing chess blindfolded, he had programmed MIT's first computer while earning a doctorate in electrical engineering. During World War II, he developed a degaussing technology that allowed Allied ships to avoid radar detection. And in the 1950s, he created an inertial guidance system that is still in use in most military and commercial aircraft. All that before he founded a conglomerate, Teledyne, in the early 1960s and became one of history's great CEOs. Conglomerates were the internet stocks of the 1960s, when large numbers of them went public. Singleton, however, ran a very unusual conglomerate. Long before it became popular, he aggressively repurchased his stock, eventually buying in over 90% of Teledyne's shares. He avoided dividends, emphasized cash flow over reported earnings, ran a famously decentralized organization, and never split the company's stock, which for much of the 1970s and 1980s was the highest priced on the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE. He was known as the Sphinx for his reluctance to speak with either analysts or journalists, and he never once appeared on the cover of Fortune magazine. Singleton was an iconoclast, and the idiosyncratic path he chose to follow caused much comment and consternation on Wall Street and in the business press. It turned out that he was right to ignore the skeptics. The long-term returns of his better-known peers were generally mediocre, averaging only 11% per annum, a small improvement over the S&P 500. Singleton, in contrast, ran Teledyne for almost 30 years, and the annual compound return to his investors was an extraordinary 20.4%. If you had invested $1 with Singleton in 1963, by 1990, when he retired as chairman in the teeth of a severe bear market, it would have been worth $180. That same dollar invested in a broad group of conglomerates would have been worth only $27, and $15 if invested in the S&P 500. Remarkably, Singleton outperformed the index by over 12 times. Using our definition of success, Singleton was a greater CEO than Jack Welch. His numbers are simply better. Not only were his per-share returns higher relative to the market and his peers, but he sustained them over a longer period of time, 28 years versus Welch's 20, and in a market environment that featured several protracted bear markets. His success did not stem from Teledyne's owning any unique, rapidly growing businesses. Rather, much of what distinguished Singleton from his peers lay in his mastery of the critical but somewhat mysterious field of capital allocation, the process of deciding how to deploy the firm's resources to earn the best possible return for shareholders. So let's spend a minute explaining what capital allocation is, and why it's so important, and why so few CEOs are really good at it. CEOs need to do two things well to be successful: run their operations efficiently and deploy the cash generated by those operations. Most CEOs, and the management books they write or read, focus on managing operations, which is undeniably important. Singleton, in contrast, gave most of his attention to the latter task. Basically, CEOs have 5 essential choices for deploying capital: investing in existing operations, acquiring other businesses, issuing dividends, paying down debt, or repurchasing stock, and 3 alternatives for raising it: tapping internal cash flow, issuing debt, or raising equity. Think of these options collectively as a toolkit. Over the long term, returns for shareholders will be determined largely by the decisions a CEO makes in choosing which tools to use, and which to avoid, among these various options. Stated simply, 2 companies with identical operating results and different approaches to allocating capital will derive 2 very different long-term outcomes for shareholders. Essentially, capital allocation is investment, and as a result, all CEOs are both capital allocators and investors. In fact, this role just might be the most important responsibility any CEO has, and yet despite its importance, there are no courses on capital allocation at the top business schools. As Warren Buffett has observed, very few CEOs come prepared for this critical task. The heads of many companies are not skilled in capital allocation. Their inadequacy is not surprising. Most bosses rise to the top because they have excelled in an area such as marketing, production, engineering, administration, or sometimes institutional politics. Once they become CEOs, they must now make capital allocation decisions, a critical job that they may have never tackled and that is not easily mastered. To stretch the point, it's as if the final step for a highly talented musician was not to perform at Carnegie Hall, but instead to be named chairman of the Federal Reserve. This inexperience has a direct and significant impact on investor returns. Buffett stressed the potential impact of this skill gap, pointing out that, after 10 years on the job, a CEO whose company annually retains earnings equal to 10% of net worth will have been responsible for the deployment of more than 60% of all the capital at work in the business. Singleton was a master capital allocator, and his decisions in navigating among these various allocation alternatives differed significantly from the decisions his peers were making, and had an enormous positive impact on long-term returns for his shareholders. Specifically, Singleton focused Teledyne's capital on selective acquisitions and a series of large share repurchases. He was restrained in issuing shares, made frequent use of debt, and did not pay a dividend until the late 1980s. In contrast, the other conglomerates pursued a mirror image allocation strategy, actively issuing shares to buy companies, paying dividends, avoiding share repurchases, and generally using less debt. In short, they deployed a different set of tools with very different results. If you think of capital allocation more broadly as resource allocation and include the deployment of human resources, you find again that Singleton had a highly differentiated approach. Specifically, he believed in an extreme form of organizational decentralization, with a wafer-thin corporate staff at headquarters and operational responsibility and authority concentrated in the general managers of the business units. This was very different from the approach of his peers, who typically had elaborate headquarters staffs replete with vice presidents and MBAs. It turns out that the most extraordinary CEOs of the last 50 years, the truly great ones, shared this mastery of resource allocation. In fact, their approach was uncannily similar to Singleton's. In 1988, Warren Buffett wrote an article on investors who shared a combination of excellent track records and devotion to the value investing principles of legendary Columbia Business School professors Benjamin Graham and David Dodd. Graham and Dodd's unorthodox investing strategy advocated buying companies that traded at material discounts to conservative assessments of their net asset values. To illustrate the strong correlation between extraordinary investment returns and Graham and Dodd's principles, Buffett used the analogy of a national coin-flipping contest in which 225 million Americans, once a day, wager $1 on a coin toss. Each day the losers drop out, and the next day the stakes grow as all prior winnings are bet on the next day's flips. After 20 days, there are 215 people left, each of whom has won a little over $1 million. Buffett points out that this outcome is purely the result of chance, and that 225 million orangutans would have produced the same result. He then introduces an interesting wrinkle. If you found, however, that 40 of them came from a particular zoo in Omaha, you would be pretty sure you were on to something. Scientific inquiry naturally follows such a pattern. If you were trying to analyze possible causes of a rare type of cancer, and you found that 400 cases occurred in some little mining town in Montana, you would get very interested in the water there, or the occupation of those afflicted, or other variables. I think you will find that a disproportionate number of successful coin flippers in the investment world came from a very small intellectual village that could be called Graham and Doddsville. If, as historian Laurel Ulrich has written, well-behaved women rarely make history, perhaps it follows that conventional CEOs rarely trounce the market or their peers. As in the world of investing, there are very few extraordinary managerial coin flippers, and if you were to list them, not surprisingly, you would find they were also iconoclasts. These managerial standouts, the ones profiled in this audiobook, ran companies in both growing and declining markets, in industries as diverse as manufacturing, media, defense, consumer products, and financial services. Their companies ranged widely in terms of size and maturity. None had hot, easily repeatable retail concepts or intellectual property advantages versus their peers, and yet they hugely outperformed them. Like Singleton, they developed unique, markedly different approaches to their businesses, typically drawing much comment and questioning from peers and the business press. Even more interestingly, although they developed these principles independently, it turned out they were iconoclastic in virtually identical ways. In other words, there seemed to be a pattern to their iconoclasm, a potential blueprint for success, one that correlated highly with extraordinary returns. They seemed to operate in a parallel universe, one defined by devotion to a shared set of principles, a worldview, which gave them citizenship in a tiny intellectual village. Call it Singletonville, a very select group of men and women who understood, among other things, that capital allocation is a CEO's most important job. What counts in the long run is the increase in per-share value, not overall growth or size. Cash flow, not reported earnings, is what determines long-term value. Decentralized organizations release entrepreneurial energy and keep both costs and rancor down. Independent thinking is essential to long-term success, and interactions with outside advisors, Wall Street, the press, etc., can be distracting and time-consuming. Sometimes the best investment opportunity is your own stock. With acquisitions, patience is a virtue, as is occasional boldness. Interestingly, their iconoclasm was reinforced in many cases by geography. For the most part, their operations were located in cities like Denver, Omaha, Los Angeles, Alexandria, Washington, and St. Louis, removed from the financial epicenter of the Boston-New York corridor. This distance helped insulate them from the din of Wall Street conventional wisdom. The two CEOs who had offices in the Northeast shared this predilection for nondescript locations. Dick Smith's office was located in the rear of a suburban shopping mall. Tom Murphy's was in a former Midtown Manhattan residence 60 blocks from Wall Street. The residents of Singletonville, our outsider CEOs, also shared an interesting set of personal characteristics. They were generally frugal, often legendarily so, and humble, analytical, and understated. They were devoted to their families, often leaving the office early to attend school events. They did not typically relish the outward-facing part of the CEO role. They did not give Chamber of Commerce speeches, and they did not attend Davos. They rarely appeared on the covers of business publications and did not write books of management advice. They were not cheerleaders or marketers or backslappers, and they did not exude charisma. They were very different from high-profile CEOs such as Steve Jobs or Sam Walton or Herb Kelleher of Southwest Airlines or Mark Zuckerberg. These geniuses are the Isaac Newtons of business, struck Apple-like by enormously powerful ideas that they proceed to execute with maniacal focus and determination. Their situations and circumstances, however, are not remotely similar, nor are the lessons from their careers remotely transferable to those of the vast majority of business executives. The outsider CEOs had neither the charisma of Walton and Kelleher nor the marketing or technical genius of Jobs or Zuckerberg. In fact, their circumstances were a lot like those of the typical American business executive. Their returns, however, were anything but quotidian. As figures P1 and P2 show, on average they outperformed the S&P 500 by over 20 times and their peers by over 7 times. and our focus will be on looking at how those returns were achieved. We will, as the Watergate informant Deep Throat suggested, follow the money, looking carefully at the key decisions these outsider CEOs made to maximize returns to shareholders, and the lessons those decisions hold for today's managers and entrepreneurs. Introduction. An intelligent iconoclasm. It is impossible to produce superior performance unless you do something different. John Templeton. The New Yorker's Atul Gawande uses the term positive deviant to describe unusually effective performers in the field of medicine. To Gawande, it is natural that we should study these outliers in order to learn from them and improve performance. Surprisingly, in business, the best are not studied as closely as in other fields like medicine, the law, politics, or sports. After studying Henry Singleton, I began, with the help of a talented group of Harvard MBA students, to look for other cases where one company handily beat both its peers and Jack Welch in terms of relative market performance. It turned out, as Warren Buffett's quote in the preface suggests, that these companies and CEOs were rare as hen's teeth. After extensive searching in databases at Harvard Business School's Baker Library, we came across only 7 other examples that passed these 2 tests. Interestingly, like Teledyne, these companies were not generally well known, nor were their CEOs, despite the enormous gap between their performance and that of many of today's high-visibility chief executives. The press portrays the successful, contemporary CEO, of which Welch is an exemplar, as a charismatic, action-oriented leader who works in a gleaming office building and is surrounded by an army of hard-working fellow MBAs. He travels by corporate jet and spends much of his time touring operations, meeting with Wall Street analysts, and attending conferences. The adjective rock star is often used to describe these fast-moving executives who are frequently recruited into their positions after well-publicized searches and usually come from top executive positions at well-known companies. Since the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, this breed of high-profile chief executive has been understandably vilified. They are commonly viewed as being greedy, possibly fraudulent, and heartless as they fly around in corporate planes, laying off workers, and making large deals that often destroy value for stockholders. In short, they're seen as being a lot like Donald Trump on The Apprentice. On that reality television show, Trump makes no pretense about being avaricious, arrogant, and promotional. Not exactly a catalog of Franklinian values. The residents of Singletonville, however, represent a refreshing rejoinder to this stereotype. All were first-time CEOs, most with very little prior management experience. Not one came to the job from a high-profile position, and all but one were new to their industries and companies. Only 2 had MBAs. As a group, they did not attract or seek the spotlight. Rather, they labored in relative obscurity and were generally appreciated by only a handful of sophisticated investors and aficionados. As a group, they shared old-fashioned, pre-modern values, including frugality, humility, independence, and an unusual combination of conservatism and boldness. They typically worked out of bare-bones offices, of which they were inordinately proud, generally eschewed perks such as corporate planes, avoided the spotlight wherever possible, and rarely communicated with Wall Street or the business press. They also actively avoided bankers and other advisors, preferring their own counsel and that of a select group around them. Ben Franklin would have liked these guys. This group of happily married, middle-aged men, and one woman, led seemingly unexciting, balanced, quietly philanthropic lives. Yet in their business lives, they were neither conventional nor complacent. They were positive deviants, and they were deeply iconoclastic. The word iconoclast is derived from Greek and means smasher of icons. The word has evolved to have the more general meaning of someone who is determinedly different, proudly eccentric. The original iconoclasts came from outside the societies and temples where icons resided. They were challengers of societal norms and conventions, and they were much feared in ancient Greece. The CEOs profiled in this audiobook were not nearly so fearsome, but they did share interesting similarities with their ancient forebears. They were also outsiders, disdaining long-accepted conventional approaches, like paying dividends or avoiding share repurchases, and relishing their unorthodoxy. Like Singleton, these CEOs consistently made very different decisions than their peers did. They were not, however, blindly contrarian. Theirs was an intelligent iconoclasm informed by careful analysis and often expressed in unusual financial metrics that were distinctly different from industry or Wall Street conventions. In this way, their iconoclasm was similar to Billy Beane's, as described by Michael Lewis in Moneyball. Beane, the general manager of the perennially cash-strapped Oakland A's baseball team, used statistical analysis to gain an edge over his better-heeled competitors. His approach centered on new metrics, on-base and slugging percentages, that correlated more highly with team winning percentage than the traditional statistical troika of home runs, batting average, and runs batted in. Beane's analytical insights influenced every aspect of how he ran the A's, from drafting and trading strategies to whether or not to steal bases or use sacrifice bunts in games. No, in both cases. His approach in all these areas was highly unorthodox, yet also highly successful, and his team, despite having the second lowest payroll in the league, made the playoffs in 4 of his first 6 years on the job. Like Beane, Singleton and these 7 other executives developed unique, iconoclastic approaches to their businesses that drew much comment and questioning from peers in the business press. And, like Beane's, their results were exceptional, handily outperforming both the legendary Welch and their industry counterparts. They came from a variety of backgrounds. One was an astronaut who had orbited the moon, one a widow with no prior business experience. One inherited the family business, 2 were highly quantitative PhDs, 1 an investor who'd never run a company before. They were all, however, new to the CEO role, and they shared a couple of important traits, including fresh eyes and a deep-seated commitment to rationality. Isaiah Berlin, in a famous essay about Leo Tolstoy, introduced the instructive contrast between the fox, who knows many things, and the hedgehog, who knows one thing but knows it very well. Most CEOs are hedgehogs. They grow up in an industry, and by the time they are tapped for the top role, have come to know it thoroughly. There are many positive attributes associated with hedgehogness, including expertise, specialization, and focus. Foxes, however, also have many attractive qualities, including an ability to make connections across fields and to innovate, and the CEOs in this audiobook were definite foxes. They had familiarity with other companies and industries and disciplines, and this ranginess translated into new perspectives, which in turn helped them to develop new approaches that eventually translated into exceptional results. In the 1986 Berkshire Hathaway annual report, Warren Buffett looked back on his first 25 years as a CEO and concluded that the most important and surprising lesson from his career to date was the discovery of a mysterious force, the corporate equivalent of teenage peer pressure, that impelled CEOs to imitate the actions of their peers. He dubbed this powerful force the institutional imperative and noted that it was nearly ubiquitous, warning that effective CEOs needed to find some way to tune it out. The CEOs in this audiobook all managed to avoid the insidious influence of this powerful imperative. How? They found an antidote in a shared managerial philosophy, a worldview that pervaded their organizations and cultures and drove their operating and capital allocating decisions. Although they arrived at their management philosophies independently, what's striking is how remarkably similar the ingredients were across this group of executives, despite widely varying industries and circumstances. Each ran a highly decentralized organization, made at least one very large acquisition, developed unusual cash flow-based metrics, and bought back a significant amount of stock. None paid meaningful dividends or provided Wall Street guidance. All received the same combination of derision, wonder, and skepticism from their peers and the business press. All also enjoyed eye-popping, credulity-straining performance over very long tenures, 20-plus years on average. The business world has traditionally divided itself into 2 basic camps, those who run companies and those who invest in them. The lessons of these iconoclastic CEOs suggest a new, more nuanced conception of the chief executive's job, with less emphasis placed on charismatic leadership and more on careful deployment of firm resources. At bottom, these CEOs thought more like investors than managers. Fundamentally, they had confidence in their own analytical skills, and on the rare occasions when they saw compelling discrepancies between value and price, they were prepared to act boldly. When their stock was cheap, they bought it, often in large quantities, and when it was expensive, they used it to buy other companies or to raise inexpensive capital to fund future growth. If they couldn't identify compelling projects, they were comfortable waiting, sometimes for very long periods of time, an entire decade in the case of General Cinema's Dick Smith. Over the long term, this systematic, methodical blend of low buying and high selling produced exceptional returns for shareholders. A Distant Mirror, 1974 to 1982. In assessing the current relevance of these outsider CEOs, it's worth looking at how each navigated the post-World War II period that looks most like today's extended economic malaise, the brutal 1974 to 1982 period. That period featured a toxic combination of an external oil shock, disastrous fiscal and monetary policy, and the worst domestic political scandal in the nation's history. This cocktail of negative news produced an 8-year period that saw crippling inflation, 2 deep recessions and bear markets, 18% interest rates, a 3-fold increase in oil prices, and the first resignation of a sitting U.S. president in over 100 years. In the middle of this dark period, in August 1979, Business Week famously ran a cover story titled, "Are Equities Dead?" The times, like now, were so uncertain and scary that most managers sat on their hands. But for all the outsider CEOs, it was among the most active periods of their careers. Every single one was engaged in either a significant share repurchase program or a series of large acquisitions, or in the case of Tom Murphy, both. As a group, they were, in the words of Warren Buffett, very greedy while their peers were deeply fearful. This reformulation of the CEO's job stemmed from shared and unusual backgrounds. All of these CEOs were outsiders. All were first-time chief executives, half not yet 40 when they took the job, and all but one were new to their industries. They were not bound by prior experience or industry convention, and their collective records show the enormous power of fresh eyes. This freshness of perspective is an age-old catalyst for innovation across many fields. In science, Thomas Kuhn, inventor of the concept of the paradigm shift, found that the greatest discoveries were almost invariably made by newcomers and the very young. Think of the middle-aged former printer, Ben Franklin, taming lightning, or Einstein, the 27-year-old patent clerk, deriving E=mc². This fox-like outsider's perspective helped these executives develop differentiated approaches, and it informed their entire management philosophy. As a group, they were deeply independent, generally avoiding communication with Wall Street, disdaining the use of advisors, and preferring decentralized organizational structures that self-selected for other independent thinkers. In his recent bestseller, Outliers, Malcolm Gladwell presents a rule of thumb that expertise across a wide variety of fields requires 10,000 hours of practice. So how does the phenomenal success of this group of neophyte CEOs square with that heuristic? Certainly none of these CEOs had logged close to 10,000 hours as managers before assuming the top spot. And perhaps their success points to an important distinction between expertise and innovation. Gladwell's rule is a guide to achieving mastery, which is not necessarily the same thing as innovation. As John Templeton's quote at the beginning of this chapter suggests, exceptional relative performance demands new thinking, and at the center of the worldview shared by these CEOs was a commitment to rationality, to analyzing the data, to thinking for themselves. These 8 CEOs were not charismatic visionaries, nor were they drawn to grandiose strategic pronouncements. They were practical and agnostic in temperament, and they systematically tuned out the noise of conventional wisdom by fostering a certain simplicity of focus, a certain asperity in their cultures and their communications. Scientists and mathematicians often speak of the clarity on the other side of complexity, and these CEOs, all of whom were quantitatively adept, more had engineering degrees than MBAs, had a genius for simplicity, for cutting through the clutter of peer and press chatter to zero in on the core economic characteristics of their businesses. In all cases, this led the outsider CEOs to focus on cash flow and to forego the blind pursuit of the Wall Street holy grail of reported earnings. Most public company CEOs focus on maximizing quarterly reported net income, which is understandable since that is Wall Street's preferred metric. Net income, however, is a bit of a blunt instrument and can be significantly distorted by differences in debt levels, taxes, capital expenditures, and past acquisition history. As a result, the outsiders, who often had complicated balance sheets, active acquisition programs, and high debt levels, believed the key to long-term value creation was to optimize free cash flow, and this emphasis on cash informed all aspects of how they ran their companies, from the way they paid for acquisitions and managed their balance sheets to their accounting policies and compensation systems. This single-minded cash focus was the foundation of their iconoclasm, and it invariably led to a laser-like focus on a few select variables that shaped each firm's strategy, usually in entirely different directions from those of industry peers. For Henry Singleton in the 1970s and 1980s, it was stock buybacks. For John Malone, it was the relentless pursuit of cable subscribers. For Bill Anders, it was divesting non-core businesses. For Warren Buffett, it was the generation and deployment of insurance float. At the core of their shared worldview was the belief that the primary goal for any CEO was to optimize long-term value per share, not organizational growth. This may seem like an obvious objective. However, in American business, there is a deeply ingrained urge to get bigger. Larger companies get more attention in the press. The executives of those companies tend to earn higher salaries and are more likely to be asked to join prestigious boards and clubs. As a result, it is very rare to see a company proactively shrink itself. And yet virtually all of these CEOs shrank their share bases significantly through repurchases. Most also shrank their operations through asset sales or spin-offs, and they were not shy about selling or closing underperforming divisions. Growth, it turns out, often doesn't correlate with maximizing shareholder value. This pragmatic focus on cash and an accompanying spirit of proud iconoclasm, with just a hint of asperity, was exemplified by Henry Singleton in a rare 1979 interview with Forbes magazine. After we acquired a number of businesses, we reflected on business. Our conclusion was that the key was cash flow. Our attitude toward cash generation and asset management came out of our own thinking. He added, as though he needed to, "It is not copied." Chapter 1. A Perpetual Motion Machine for Returns. Tom Murphy and Capital Cities Broadcasting. Tom Murphy and Dan Burke were probably the greatest two-person combination in management that the world has ever seen, or maybe ever will see. Warren Buffett. In speaking with business school classes, Warren Buffett often compares the rivalry between Tom Murphy's company, Capital Cities Broadcasting, and CBS to a transatlantic race between a rowboat and the QE2 to illustrate the tremendous effect management can have on long-term returns. When Murphy became the CEO of Capital Cities in 1966, CBS, run by the legendary Bill Paley, was the dominant media business in the country, with TV and radio stations in the country's largest markets, the top-rated broadcast network, and valuable publishing and music properties. In contrast, at that time, Capital Cities had 5 TV stations and 4 radio stations, all in smaller markets. CBS's market capitalization was 16 times the size of Capital Cities. By the time Murphy sold his company to Disney 30 years later, however, Capital Cities was 3 times as valuable as CBS. In other words, the rowboat had won, decisively. So, how did the seemingly insurmountable gap between these two companies get closed? The answer lies in fundamentally different management approaches. CBS spent much of the 1960s and 1970s taking the enormous cash flow generated by its network and broadcast operations and funding an aggressive acquisition program that led it into entirely new fields, including the purchase of a toy business and the New York Yankees baseball team. CBS issued stock to fund some of these acquisitions, built a landmark office building in Midtown Manhattan at enormous expense, developed a corporate structure with 42 presidents and vice presidents, and generally displayed what Buffett's partner, Charlie Munger, calls a prosperity-blinded indifference to unnecessary costs. Paley's strategy at CBS was consistent with the conventional wisdom of the conglomerate era, which espoused the elusive benefits of diversification and synergy to justify the acquisition of unrelated businesses that, once combined with the parent company, would magically become both more profitable and less susceptible to the economic cycle. At its core, Paley's strategy focused on making CBS larger. In contrast, Murphy's goal was to make his company more valuable. As he said to me, "The goal is not to have the longest train, but to arrive at the station first using the least fuel." Under Murphy and his lieutenant, Dan Burke, capital cities rejected diversification and instead created an unusually streamlined conglomerate that focused laser-like on the media businesses it knew well. Murphy acquired more radio and TV stations, operated them superbly well, regularly repurchased his shares, and eventually acquired CBS's rival broadcast network, ABC. The relative results speak for themselves. The formula that allowed Murphy to overtake Paley's QE2 was deceptively simple. Focus on industries with attractive economic characteristics, selectively use leverage to buy occasional large properties, improve operations, pay down debt, and repeat. As Murphy put it succinctly in an interview with Forbes, "We just kept opportunistically buying assets, intelligently leveraging the company, improving operations, and then we'd take a bite of something else." What's interesting, however, is that his peers at other media companies didn't follow this path. Rather, they tended, like CBS, to follow fashion and diversify into unrelated businesses, build large corporate staffs, and overpay for marquee media properties. Capital Cities under Murphy was an extremely successful example of what we would now call a roll-up. In a typical roll-up, a company acquires a series of businesses, attempts to improve operations, and then keeps acquiring, benefiting over time from scale advantages and best management practices. This concept came into vogue in the mid to late 1990s and flamed out in the early 2000s as many of the leading companies collapsed under the burden of too much debt. These companies typically failed because they acquired too rapidly and underestimated the difficulty and importance of integrating acquisitions and improving operations. Murphy's approach to the roll-up was different. He moved slowly, developed real operational expertise, and focused on a small number of large acquisitions that he knew to be high-probability bets. Under Murphy, capital cities combined excellence in both operations and capital allocation to an unusual degree. As Murphy told me, "The business of business is a lot of little decisions every day mixed up with a few big decisions." Tom Murphy was born in 1925 in Brooklyn, New York. He served in the Navy in World War II, graduated from Cornell on the GI Bill, and was a prominent member of the legendary Harvard Business School, HBS, class of 1949, whose graduates included a future SEC chairman and numerous successful entrepreneurs and Fortune 500 CEOs. After graduation from HBS, Murphy worked as a product manager for consumer packaged goods giant Lever Brothers. Ironically, since he's a teetotaler, his life changed irrevocably when he attended a summer cocktail party in 1954 at his parents' home in Schenectady, New York. His father, a prominent local judge, had also invited a longtime friend, Frank Smith, the business manager for famed broadcast journalist Lowell Thomas and a serial entrepreneur. Smith immediately pigeonholed Murphy and began to tell him about his latest venture, WTEN, a struggling UHF TV station in Albany that Smith had just purchased out of bankruptcy. The station was located in an abandoned former convent, and before the evening was over, young Murphy had agreed to leave his prestigious job in New York and relocate to Albany to run it. He had no broadcasting experience, nor, for that matter, any relevant management experience of any kind. From the outset, Smith managed the business from his office in downtown Manhattan, leaving day-to-day operations largely to Murphy. After a couple of years of operating losses, Murphy turned the station into a consistent cash generator by improving programming and aggressively managing costs, a formula that the company would apply repeatedly in the years ahead. In 1957, Smith and Murphy bought a second station in Raleigh, North Carolina, this one located in a former sanitarium. After the addition of a third station in Providence, Rhode Island, the company adopted the name Capital Cities. In 1961, Murphy hired Dan Burke, a 30-year-old Harvard MBA, also with no prior broadcast experience, as his replacement at the Albany station. Burke had been originally introduced to Murphy in the late 1950s by his older brother Jim, who was a classmate of Murphy's at HBS and a rising young executive at Johnson & Johnson. He would eventually become CEO and win accolades for his handling of the Tylenol crisis in the mid-1980s. Dan Burke had served in the Korean War and then entered HBS, graduating in the class of 1955. He then joined General Foods as a product manager in the Jell-O division, and in 1961 signed on with Capital Cities, where Murphy quickly indoctrinated him into the company's lean, decentralized operating philosophy, which he would come to exemplify. Murphy then moved to New York to work with Smith to build the company through acquisition. Over the next 4 years, under Smith and Murphy's direction, Capital Cities grew by selectively acquiring additional radio and television stations, until Smith's death in 1966. After Smith's death, Murphy became CEO at age 40. The company had finished the preceding year with revenue of just $28 million. Murphy's first move was to elevate Burke to the role of president and chief operating officer. Theirs was an excellent partnership with a very clear division of labor. Burke was responsible for daily management of operations, and Murphy for acquisitions, capital allocation, and occasional interaction with Wall Street. As Burke told me, our relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect. I had an appetite for and a willingness to do things that Murphy was not interested in doing. Burke believed his job was to create the free cash flow and Murphy's was to spend it. He exemplifies the central role played in this audiobook by exceptionally strong COOs, whose close oversight of operations allowed their CEO partners to focus on longer-term strategic and capital allocation issues. Once in the CEO seat, it did not take Murphy long to make his mark. In 1967, he bought KTRK, the Houston ABC affiliate, for $22 million, the largest acquisition in broadcast history up to that time. In 1968, Murphy bought Fairchild Communications, a leading publisher of trade magazines, for $42 million. And in 1970, he made his largest purchase yet with the acquisition of broadcaster Triangle Communications from Walter Annenberg for $120 million. After the Triangle transaction, Capital Cities owned 5 VHF TV stations, the maximum then allowed by the FCC. Murphy next turned his attention to newspaper publishing, which, as an advertising-driven business with attractive margins and strong competitive barriers, had close similarities to the broadcasting business. After purchasing several small dailies in the early 1970s, he bought the Fort Worth Telegram for $75 million in 1974 and the Kansas City Star for $95 million in 1977. In 1980, looking for other growth avenues in related businesses, he entered the nascent cable television business with the purchase of Cablecom for $139 million. During the extended bear market of the mid-1970s to early 1980s, Murphy became an aggressive purchaser of his own shares, eventually buying in close to 50%, most of it at single-digit price-to-earnings, PE, multiples. In 1984, the FCC relaxed its station ownership rules, and in January 1986, Murphy, in his masterstroke, bought the ABC network and its related broadcasting assets, including major market TV stations in New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, for nearly $3.5 billion, with financing from his friend Warren Buffett. The ABC deal was the largest non-oil and gas transaction in business history to that point, and an enormous bet-the-company transaction for Murphy, representing over 100% of Capital Cities' enterprise value. The acquisition stunned the media world and was greeted with the headline, "Minnow Swallows Whale," in the Wall Street Journal. At closing, Burke said to media investor Gordon Crawford, "This is the acquisition I've been training for my whole life." The core economic rationale for the deal was Murphy's conviction that he could improve the margins for ABC's TV stations from the low 30s up to Capital City's industry-leading levels, 50+%. Under Burke's oversight, the staff that oversaw ABC's TV station group dropped from 60 to 8. The head count at the flagship WABC station in New York was reduced from 600 to 400, and the margin gap was closed in just 2 years. Burke and Murphy wasted little time in implementing Capital City's lean, decentralized approach, immediately cutting unnecessary perks, such as the executive elevator and the private dining room, and moving quickly to eliminate redundant positions, laying off 1,500 employees in the first several months after the transaction closed. They also consolidated offices and sold off unnecessary real estate, collecting $175 million for the headquarters building in Midtown Manhattan. As Bob Zelnick of ABC News said, "After the mid-'80s, we stopped flying first class." A story from this time demonstrates the culture clash between network executives and the leaner, more entrepreneurial acquirers. ABC, in fact the whole broadcasting industry, was a limousine culture. One of the most cherished perks for an industry executive was the ability to take a limo for even a few blocks to lunch. Murphy, however, was a cab man, and from very early on showed up to all ABC meetings in cabs. Before long, this practice rippled through the ABC executive ranks, and the broader Capital City's ethos slowly began to permeate the ABC culture. When asked whether this was a case of leading by example, Murphy responded, "Is there any other way?" In the 9 years after the transaction, revenues and cash flows grew significantly in every major ABC business line, including the TV stations, the publishing assets, and ESPN. Even the network, which had been in last place at the time of the acquisition, was ranked #1 in primetime ratings and was more profitable than either CBS or NBC. Capital Cities never made another large-scale acquisition after the ABC deal, focusing instead on integration, smaller acquisitions, and continued stock repurchases. In 1993, immediately after his 65th birthday, Burke retired from Capital Cities, surprising even Murphy. Burke subsequently bought the Portland Sea Dogs baseball team, where he oversaw the rebirth of that franchise, now one of the most respected in the minor leagues. In the summer of 1995, Buffett suggested to Murphy that he sit down with Michael Eisner, the CEO of Disney, at the annual Allen & Company gathering of media nabobs in Sun Valley, Idaho. Murphy, who was 70 years old and without an apparent successor, agreed to meet Eisner, who had expressed an interest in buying the company. Over several days, Murphy negotiated an extraordinary $19 billion price for his shareholders, a multiple of 13.5 times cash flow and 28 times net income. Murphy took a seat on Disney's board and subsequently retired from active management. He left behind an ecstatic group of shareholders. If you had invested $1 with Tom Murphy as he became CEO in 1966, that dollar would have been worth $204 by the time he sold the company to Disney. That's a remarkable 19.9% internal rate of return over 29 years, significantly outpacing the 10.1% return for the S&P 500 and 13.2% return for an index of leading media companies over the same period. The investment also proved lucrative for Warren Buffett, generating a compound annual return of greater than 20% for Berkshire Hathaway over a 10-year holding period. As Figure 1.1 shows, in his 29 years at Capital Cities, Murphy outperformed the S&P by a phenomenal 16.7 times and his peers by almost fourfold. The nuts and bolts. One of the major themes in this audiobook is resource allocation. There are two basic types of resources that any CEO needs to allocate: financial and human. We've touched on the former already. The latter is, however, also critically important, and here again the outsider CEOs shared an unconventional approach, one that emphasized flat organizations and dehydrated corporate staffs. There is a fundamental humility to decentralization, an admission that headquarters does not have all the answers, and that much of the real value is created by local managers in the field. At no company was decentralization more central to the corporate ethos than at Capital Cities. The hallmark of the company's culture, extraordinary autonomy for operating managers, was stated succinctly in a single paragraph on the inside cover of every capital city's annual report. Decentralization is the cornerstone of our philosophy. Our goal is to hire the best people we can and give them the responsibility and authority they need to perform their jobs. All decisions are made at the local level. We expect our managers to be forever cost-conscious and to recognize and exploit sales potential. Headquarters staff was anorexic, and its primary purpose was to support the general managers of operating units. There were no vice presidents in functional areas like marketing, strategic planning, or human resources. No corporate counsel and no public relations department. Murphy's secretary fielded all calls from the media. In the capital city's culture, the publishers and station managers had the power and prestige internally, and they almost never heard from New York if they were hitting their numbers. It was an environment that selected for and promoted independent entrepreneurial general managers. The company's guiding human resource philosophy, repeated ad infinitum by Murphy, was to hire the best people you can and leave them alone. As Burke told me, the company's extreme decentralized approach kept both costs and rancor down. The guinea pig in the development of this philosophy was Dan Burke himself. In 1961, after he took over as general manager at WTEN, Burke began sending weekly memos to Murphy, as he had been trained to do at General Foods. After several months of receiving no response, he stopped sending them, realizing his time was better spent on local operations than on reporting to headquarters. As Burke said in describing his early years in Albany, Murphy delegates to the point of anarchy. Frugality was also central to the ethos. Murphy and Burke realized early on that while you couldn't control your revenues at a TV station, you could control your costs. They believed that the best defense against the revenue lumpiness inherent in advertising-supported businesses was a constant vigilance on costs, which became deeply embedded in the company's culture. In fact, in one of the earliest and most often told corporate legends, Murphy even scrutinized the company's expenditures on paint. Shortly after Murphy arrived in Albany, Smith asked him to paint the dilapidated former convent that housed the studio to project a more professional image to advertisers. Murphy's immediate response was to paint the two sides facing the road, leaving the other sides untouched, forever cost-conscious. A picture of WTEN still hangs in Murphy's New York office. Murphy and Burke believed that even the smallest operating decisions, particularly those relating to headcount, could have unforeseen long-term costs and needed to be watched constantly. Phil Meek, head of the publishing division, took this message to heart and ran the entire publishing operation, 6 daily newspapers, several magazine groups, and a stable of weekly shoppers, with only 3 people at headquarters, including an administrative assistant. Burke pursued economic efficiency with a zeal that earned him the nickname the Cardinal. To run the company's dispersed operations, he developed a legendarily detailed annual budgeting process. Each year, every general manager came to New York for extensive budget meetings. In these sessions, management presented operating and capital budgets for the coming year, and Burke and his CFO, Ron Derfler, went through them in line-by-line detail. Interestingly, Burke could be as tough on minority hiring shortfalls as on excessive costs. The budget sessions were not perfunctory and almost always produced material changes. Particular attention was paid to capital expenditures and expenses. Managers were expected to outperform their peers, and great attention was paid to margins, which Burke viewed as a form of report card. Outside of these meetings, managers were left alone and sometimes went months without hearing from corporate. The company did not simply cut its way to high margins, however. It also emphasized investing in its businesses for long-term growth. Murphy and Burke realized that the key drivers of profitability in most of their businesses were revenue growth and advertising market share, and they were prepared to invest in their properties to ensure leadership in local markets. For example, Murphy and Burke realized early on that the TV station that was number 1 in local news ended up with a disproportionate share of the market's advertising revenue. As a result, capital cities stations always invested heavily in news talent and technology, and remarkably, virtually every one of its stations led in its local market. In another example, Burke insisted on spending substantially more money to upgrade the Fort Worth printing plant than Phil Meek had requested, realizing the importance of color printing in maintaining the Telegram's long-term competitive position. As Phil Buth, an early employee, told me, the company was careful, not just cheap. The company's hiring practices were equally unconventional. With no prior broadcasting experience themselves before joining Capital Cities, Murphy and Burke shared a clear preference for intelligence, ability, and drive over direct industry experience. They were looking for talented, younger foxes with fresh perspectives. When the company made an acquisition or entered a new industry, it inevitably designated a top Capital Cities executive, often from an unrelated division, to oversee the new property. In this vein, Bill James, who had been running the flagship radio property, WJR in Detroit, was tapped to run the cable division, and John Sias, previously head of the publishing division, took over the ABC network. Neither had any prior industry experience. Both produced excellent results. Murphy and Burke were also comfortable giving responsibility to promising young managers. As Murphy described it to me, we'd been fortunate enough to have it ourselves and knew it could work. Bill James was 35 and had no radio experience when he took over WJR. Phil Meek came over from the Ford Motor Company at 32 with no publishing experience to run the Pontiac Press. And Bob Iger was 37 and had spent his career in broadcast sports when he moved from New York to Hollywood to assume responsibility for ABC Entertainment. The company also had exceptionally low turnover. As Robert Price, a rival broadcaster, once remarked, "We always see lots of resumes, but we never see any from Capital Cities." Dan Burke related to me a conversation with Frank Smith on the effectiveness of this philosophy. Burke recalls Smith saying, "The system in place corrupts you with so much autonomy and authority that you can't imagine leaving." In the area of capital allocation, Murphy's approach was highly differentiated from his peers. He eschewed diversification, paid de minimis dividends, rarely issued stock, made active use of leverage, regularly repurchased shares, and between long periods of inactivity, made the occasional very large acquisition. The two primary sources of capital for Capital Cities were internal operating cash flow and debt. As we've seen, the company produced consistently high, industry-leading levels of operating cash flow, providing Murphy with a reliable source of capital to allocate to acquisitions, buybacks, debt repayment, and other investment options. Murphy also frequently used debt to fund acquisitions, once summarizing his approach as, "Always, we've taken the assets once we've paid them off and leveraged them again to buy other assets." After closing an acquisition, Murphy actively deployed free cash flow to reduce debt levels, and these loans were typically paid down ahead of schedule. The bulk of the ABC debt was retired within 3 years of the transaction. Interestingly, Murphy never borrowed money to fund a share repurchase, preferring to utilize leverage for the purchase of operating businesses. Murphy and Burke actively avoided dilution from equity offerings. Other than the sale of stock to Berkshire Hathaway to help finance the ABC acquisition, the company did not issue new stock over the 20 years prior to the Disney sale, and over this period total shares outstanding shrank by 47% as a result of repeated repurchases. Acquisitions were far and away the largest outlet for the company's capital during Murphy's tenure. According to recent studies, somewhere around 2/3 of all acquisitions actually destroy value for shareholders. How then was such enormous value created by acquisitions at Capital Cities? Acquisitions were Murphy's bailiwick, and where he spent the majority of his time. He did not delegate acquisition decisions, never used investment bankers, and over time evolved an idiosyncratic approach that was both effective and different in significant and important ways from his competitors. To Murphy, as a capital allocator, the company's extreme decentralization had important benefits. It allowed the company to operate more profitably than its peers. Capital Cities had the highest margins in each of its business lines, which in turn gave the company an advantage in acquisitions by allowing Murphy to buy properties and know that under Burke, they would quickly be made more profitable, lowering the effective price paid. In other words, the company's operating and integration expertise occasionally gave Murphy that scarcest of business commodities, conviction. And when he had conviction, Murphy was prepared to act aggressively. Under his leadership, Capital Cities was extremely acquisitive, 3 separate times doing the largest deal in the history of the broadcast industry, culminating in the massive ABC transaction. Over this time period, the company was also involved with several of the largest newspaper acquisitions in the country, as well as transactions in the radio, cable TV, and magazine publishing industries. Murphy was willing to wait a long time for an attractive acquisition. He once said, "I get paid not just to make deals, but to make good deals." When he saw something that he liked, however, Murphy was prepared to make a very large bet, and much of the value created during his nearly 30-year tenure as CEO was the result of a handful of large acquisition decisions, each of which produced excellent long-term returns. These acquisitions each represented 25% or more of the company's market capitalization at the time they were made. Murphy was a master at prospecting for deals. He was known for his sense of humor and for his honesty and integrity. Unlike other media company CEOs, he stayed out of the public eye, although this became more difficult after the ABC acquisition. These traits helped him as he prospected for potential acquisitions. Murphy knew what he wanted to buy, and he spent years developing relationships with the owners of desirable properties. He never participated in a hostile takeover situation, and every major transaction that the company completed was sourced via direct contact with sellers, such as Walter Annenberg of Triangle and Leonard Goldenson of ABC. He worked hard to become a preferred buyer by treating employees fairly and running properties that were consistent leaders in their markets. This reputation helped him enormously when he approached Goldenson about buying ABC in 1984. In his typical self-deprecating style, Murphy began his pitch with, "Leonard, please don't throw me out the window, but I'd like to buy your company." Beneath this avuncular, outgoing exterior, however, lurked a razor-sharp business mind. Murphy was a highly disciplined buyer who had strict return requirements and did not stretch for acquisitions, once missing a very large newspaper transaction involving 3 Texas properties over a $5 million difference in price. Like others in this audiobook, he relied on simple but powerful rules in evaluating transactions. For Murphy, that benchmark was a double-digit after-tax return over 10 years without leverage. As a result of this pricing discipline, he never prevailed in an auction, although he participated in many. Murphy told me that his auction bids consistently ended up at only 60 to 70% of the eventual transaction price. Murphy had an unusual negotiating style. He believed in leaving something on the table for the seller and said that in the best transactions, everyone came away happy. He would often ask the seller what they thought their property was worth, and if he thought their offer was fair, he'd take it, as he did when Annenberg told him the Triangle stations were worth 10 times pre-tax profits. If he thought their proposal was high, he would counter with his best price, and if the seller rejected his offer, Murphy would walk away. He believed this straightforward approach saved time and avoided unnecessary acrimony. Share repurchases were another important outlet for Murphy, providing him with an important capital allocation benchmark, and he made frequent use of them over the years. When the company's multiple was low relative to private market comparables, Murphy bought back stock. Over the years, Murphy devoted over $1.8 billion to buybacks, mostly at single-digit multiples of cash flow. Collectively, these repurchases represented a very large bet for the company, second in size only to the ABC transaction, and they generated excellent returns for shareholders, with a cumulative compound return of 22.4% over 19 years. As Murphy says today, "I only wished I'd bought more." The Publishing Division. After the Triangle transaction in 1970, Capital Cities was prevented from owning additional TV stations by FCC regulations. As a result, Murphy turned his attention to newspapers and, between 1974 and 1978, initiated the 2 largest transactions in the industry's history to that time: the acquisition of the Fort Worth Telegram and the Kansas City Star, as well as the purchase of several smaller daily and weekly newspapers across the United States. The company's performance in its newspaper publishing division provides an interesting litmus test of its operating skills. Under the leadership of Jim Hale and Phil Meek, Capital Cities evolved an approach to the newspaper business that grew out of its experience in operating TV stations, with an emphasis on careful cost control and maximizing advertising market share. What is remarkable in looking at the company's 4 major newspaper operations is the consistent year after year after year growth in revenues and operating cash flow. Amazingly, these properties, which were sold to Knight Ridder in 1997, collectively produced a 25% compound rate of return over an average 20-year holding period. According to the Kansas City Star's publisher Bob Woodworth, subsequently the CEO of Pulitzer, Inc., the operating margin at the Star, the company's largest paper, expanded from the single digits in the mid-1970s to a high of 35% in 1996, while cash flow grew from $12.5 million to $68 million. The phenomenal long-term performance of capital cities drew the admiration of the country's top media investors. Warren Buffett and Mario Gabelli each went back to the legendary Yankee sluggers of their respective eras, Ruth and Gehrig for Buffett and Mantle and Maris for Gabelli, to find analogies for Murphy and Burke's managerial performance. Gordon Crawford, a shareholder from 1972 until the Disney sale, and one of the most influential media investors in the country, believed Murphy and Burke's unique blend of operating and capital allocation skills created a perpetual motion machine for returns. Capital Cities admirers also included Bill Ruane of Ruane Cunniff and David Wargo of State Street Research. Chronicle Publishing, a successful transplant. Capital Cities' distinctive approach to operations and human resources was successfully transplanted to a West Coast media company, Chronicle Publishing, in the mid to late 1990s by John Sias, the former head of Capital Cities' publishing division and the ABC network. In 1993, Sias took over as the CEO of Chronicle, a diversified, family-owned media company headquartered in San Francisco. Chronicle owned the San Francisco Chronicle newspaper, the NBC affiliate in San Francisco, KRON, 300,000 cable subscribers, and a book publishing company. Prior to Sias's arrival, the company had been torn by family squabbling, and operations had suffered. Sias and his young CFO, Alan Nichols, wasted no time in implementing the Capital Cities operating model, radically transforming the company's operations. They immediately eliminated an entire layer of executives at corporate headquarters, instituted a rigorous budgeting process, and gave significant authority and autonomy to the general managers, many of whom, uncomfortable in the new, more demanding culture, left in the first year. The results were stunning. The margins at KRON improved by an incredible 2,000 basis points, from 30% to 50%. KRON was eventually sold for over $730 million in June 2000, and the operating margins at the Chronicle newspaper, which operated under an unusual joint operating agreement with the San Francisco Examiner, more than doubled, from 4% to 10%. Hearst bought the paper for an astronomical $660 million in 1999. Sias and Nichols also merged the cable subscribers into Telecommunications Inc., TCI, in a tax-free exchange and sold the book division at an attractive price to one of the family members. Sias retired from the company in 1999 after having created hundreds of millions of dollars of value for its shareholders. The diaspora. As with the large number of successful NFL coaches who once worked for Bill Walsh, or surgeons who worked at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston in the 1950s and 1960s under Francis Moore, the media world is littered with Capital Cities alums. The company's culture and operating model were widely admired, and in addition to Sias at Chronicle, former company executives have occupied top management slots at a dizzying variety of media companies, starting with Disney itself, now run by Bob Iger. Capital Cities alums have also held executive positions at LIN Broadcasting, CEO, Pulitzer, CEO, Hearst, CFO, and E.W. Scripps, head of newspaper operations, among others. Dan Burke's son, Steve, formerly COO of Comcast, is now the CEO of NBC Universal. Although the focus here is on quantifiable business performance, it is worth noting that Murphy built a universally admired company at Capital Cities with an exceptionally strong culture and esprit de corps. At least 2 different groups of executives still hold regular reunions. The company was widely respected by employees, advertisers, and community leaders, in addition to Wall Street analysts. Phil Meek told me a story about a bartender at one of the management retreats who made a handsome return by buying Capital City stock in the early 1970s. When an executive later asked why he had made the investment, the bartender replied, "I've worked at a lot of corporate events over the years, but Capital Cities was the only company where you couldn't tell who the bosses were." TransDigm, a contemporary doppelganger. A contemporary analog for Capital Cities can be found in TransDigm, a little-known, publicly traded aerospace components manufacturer. This remarkable company has grown its cash flow at a compound rate of over 25% since 1993 through a combination of internal growth and an exceptionally effective acquisition program. Like Capital Cities, the company focuses on a very specific type of business with exceptional economic characteristics. In TransDigm's case, this area of specialization is highly engineered aviation parts and components. These parts, once engineered into a military or commercial aircraft, cannot be easily replaced and require regular maintenance and replacement. They are critical to the performance of the aircraft and have no substitutes, and their cost is insignificant relative to the overall cost of the aircraft. As a result, their customers, the largest military and commercial aircraft manufacturers, are more focused on performance than price, and the company has an attractive combination of pricing power and phenomenal margins. Cash flow, defined as EBITDA or earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, margins are north of 40%. TransDigm's management team, led by CEO Nick Howley, realized these excellent economic characteristics in the early 1990s and evolved a highly decentralized corporate structure and operating system for optimizing the profitability of these specialized parts businesses. Howley, like Murphy at Capital Cities, knows that his team will be able to quickly and dramatically improve the profitability of acquired companies, lowering the effective purchase price paid and providing a compelling logic for future acquisitions. Since going public, the company has also pursued an unusual and aggressive capital allocation strategy, one that has caused a fair amount of comment and confusion on Wall Street, maintaining generally high levels of leverage, repurchasing shares, and announcing a large special dividend, financed with debt, in the depths of the recent financial crisis. Not surprisingly, returns for the shareholders have also been excellent. The stock has appreciated over fourfold since the company's 2006 initial public offering. Chapter 2. An Unconventional Conglomerateur, Henry Singleton and Teledyne. Henry Singleton has the best operating and capital deployment record in American business. If one took the 100 top business school graduates and made a composite of their triumphs, their record would not be as good as Singleton's. Warren Buffett, 1980. I change my mind when the facts change. What do you do? John Maynard Keynes. In early 1987, Teledyne, a mid-sized conglomerate with a reputation for unconventional behavior, declared a dividend. This seemingly innocuous event attracted inordinate attention in the business press, including a front-page article in the Wall Street Journal. What did the journal find so newsworthy? For most of the 20th century, public companies were expected to pay out a portion of their annual profits as dividends. Many investors, particularly senior citizens, relied on these dividends for income and looked closely at dividend levels and policies in making investment decisions. Teledyne, however, alone among 1960s-era conglomerates, steadfastly refused to pay dividends, believing them to be tax inefficient. Dividends are taxed twice, once at the corporate level and again at the individual level. In fact, under its reclusive founder and CEO, Henry Singleton, this dividend policy was, as we've seen, just one in a series of highly unusual and contrarian practices at Teledyne. In addition to eschewing dividends, Singleton ran a notoriously decentralized operation, avoided interacting with Wall Street analysts, didn't split his stock, and repurchased his shares as no one else ever has, before or since. All of this was highly unusual and idiosyncratic, but what really set Singleton apart and eventually made him a Garbo-like legend was his returns, which dwarfed both the market and his conglomerate peers. Singleton managed to grow values at an extraordinary rate across almost 30 years of wildly varying macroeconomic conditions, starting in the go-go stock market of the 1960s and ending in the deep bear market of the early 1990s. He did this by continually adapting to changing market conditions and by maintaining a dogged focus on capital allocation. His approach differed significantly from his peers, and the seeds of this iconoclasm can be traced to his background, which was highly unusual for a Fortune 500 CEO. Born in 1916 in tiny Hazlet, Texas, Singleton was a highly accomplished mathematician and scientist who never earned an MBA. Instead, he attended MIT, where he earned bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in electrical engineering. Singleton programmed the first student computer at MIT as part of his doctoral thesis, and in 1939 won the Putnam Medal as the top mathematics student in the country. Future winners would include the Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. He was also an avid chess player who was 100 points shy of the Grand Master level. After graduation from MIT in 1950, he worked as a research engineer at North American Aviation and Hughes Aircraft. He was then recruited by the legendary former whiz kid Tex Thornton to Litton Industries, where in the late 1950s, he invented an inertial guidance system that is still used in commercial and military aircraft. Singleton was promoted to general manager of Litton's Electronic Systems Group, and under his leadership that division grew to be the company's largest, with over $80 million in revenue by the end of the decade. Singleton left Litton in 1960 after it became clear to him that he would not succeed Thornton as CEO. He was 43 years old. His colleague, George Kosmetsky, who ran Litton's Electronic Components Group, left with him, and together in July 1960 they founded Teledyne. They started by acquiring 3 small electronics companies, and using this base, they successfully bid for a large naval contract. Teledyne became a public company in 1961 at the dawn of the conglomerate era. Conglomerates, companies with many unrelated business units, were the Internet stocks of their day. Taking advantage of their stratospheric stock prices, they grew by voraciously and often indiscriminately acquiring businesses in a wide range of industries. These purchases initially brought higher profits, which led to still higher stock prices that were then used to buy more companies. Most conglomerates built up large corporate headquarters staffs in the belief that they could find and exploit synergies across their disparate companies, and they actively courted Wall Street and the press in order to boost their stock. Their halcyon days, however, came to an abrupt end in the late 1960s when the largest of them, ITT, Litton Industries, and so on, began to miss earnings estimates and their stock prices fell precipitously. The conventional wisdom today is that conglomerates are an inefficient form of corporate organization, lacking the agility and focus of pure-play companies. It was not always so. For most of the 1960s, conglomerates enjoyed lofty price-to-earnings, PE ratios, and used the currency of their high-priced stock to engage in a prolonged frenzy of acquisition. During this heady period, there was significantly less competition for acquisitions than today. Private equity firms did not yet exist, and the price to buy control of an operating company, measured by its PE ratio, was often materially less than the multiple the acquirer traded for in the stock market, providing a compelling logic for acquisitions. Singleton took full advantage of this extended arbitrage opportunity to develop a diversified portfolio of businesses, and between 1961 and 1969, he purchased 130 companies in industries ranging from aviation electronics to specialty metals and insurance. All but 2 of these companies were acquired using Teledyne's pricey stock. Singleton's approach to acquisitions, however, differed from that of other conglomerators. He did not buy indiscriminately, avoiding turnaround situations, and focusing instead on profitable, growing companies with leading market positions, often in niche markets. As Jack Hamilton, who ran Teledyne's Specialty Metals division, summarized his business to me, "We specialized in high-margin products that were sold by the ounce, not the ton." Singleton was a very disciplined buyer, never paying more than 12 times earnings and purchasing most companies at significantly lower multiples. This compares to the high PE multiple on Teledyne stock, which ranged from a low of 20 to a high of 50 over this period. In 1967, in his largest acquisition to date, Singleton acquired Vasco Metals for $43 million and elevated its president, George Roberts, to the role of president of Teledyne, taking the titles of CEO and chairman for himself. Roberts had been Singleton's roommate at the Naval Academy, where he had been admitted at age 16 as the youngest freshman in the school's history, before both he and Singleton transferred due to Depression-era tuition aid cuts. Roberts also had a scientific background, having graduated from Carnegie Mellon with a Ph.D. in metallurgy before holding a series of executive positions at various specialty metals companies, eventually joining Vasco in the early 1960s as president. Once Roberts joined the company, Singleton began to remove himself from operations, freeing up the majority of his time to focus on strategic and capital allocation issues. Shortly thereafter, Singleton became the first of the conglomerateurs to stop acquiring. In mid-1969, with the multiple on his stock falling and acquisition prices rising, he abruptly dismissed his acquisition team. Singleton, as a disciplined buyer, realized that with a lower P/E ratio, the currency of his stock was no longer attractive for acquisitions. From this point on, the company never made another material purchase and never issued another share of stock. The effectiveness of this acquisition strategy can be seen in Table 2.1. Over its first 10 years as a public company, Teledyne's earnings per share, EPS, grew an astonishing 64-fold, while shares outstanding grew less than 14 times, resulting in significant value creation for shareholders. Singleton came of age at a time when there was great faith in quantitative expertise. The 1940s and 1950s were the era of the whiz kids, a group of exceptionally talented young mathematicians and engineers who used advanced statistical analysis to transform a succession of iconic American institutions, starting with the Army Air Corps, precursor to the modern Air Force, in World War II, continuing with the Ford Motor Company during the 1950s, and culminating in the Pentagon with the naming of former whiz kid Robert McNamara as Defense Secretary in 1961. The power in these organizations lay at headquarters with an elite core of young, exceptionally bright, quantitatively adept executives who exerted centralized control and put new, mathematically based systems in place for running operations. Analytical talent imposed order on far-flung, chaotic operations, resulting in greater efficiency, whether of bombing raids or manufacturing plants. Many conglomerators adopted this headquarters-centric approach to running their companies and developed large corporate staffs, replete with vice presidents and planning departments. Interestingly, Singleton, who had worked closely with Tex Thornton, one of the original whiz kids, devised an entirely different approach for his company. In contrast to peers like Thornton and Harold Janine at ITT, Singleton and Roberts eschewed the then-trendy concepts of integration and synergy, and instead emphasized extreme decentralization, breaking the company into its smallest component parts and driving accountability and managerial responsibility as far down into the organization as possible. At headquarters, there were fewer than 50 people in a company with over 40,000 total employees, and no human resource, investor relations, or business development departments. Ironically, the most successful conglomerate of the era was actually the least conglomerate-like in its operations. This decentralization fostered an objective, apolitical culture at Teledyne. Several former company presidents mentioned this refreshing lack of politics. Managers who made their numbers did well, those who did not moved on. As one told me, no one worried who Henry was having lunch with. Once the acquisition engine had slowed in 1969, Roberts and Singleton turned their attention to the company's existing operations. In another departure from conventional wisdom, Singleton eschewed reported earnings, the key metric on Wall Street at the time, running his company instead to optimize free cash flow. He and his CFO, Jerry Jerome, devised a unique metric that they termed the Teledyne return, which by averaging cash flow and net income for each business unit, emphasized cash generation and became the basis for bonus compensation for all business unit general managers. As he once told Financial World magazine, "If anyone wants to follow Teledyne, they should get used to the fact that our quarterly earnings will jiggle. Our accounting is set to maximize cash flow, not reported earnings." Not a quote you're likely to hear from the typical Wall Street-focused Fortune 500 CEO today. Singleton and Roberts quickly improved margins and dramatically reduced working capital at Teledyne's operations, generating significant cash in the process. The results can be seen in the consistently high return on assets for Teledyne's operating businesses, which averaged north of 20% throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Warren Buffett's partner, Charlie Munger, describes these extraordinary results as miles higher than anyone else, utterly ridiculous. Packard Bell, a rare misstep. One division that did not meet Singleton's exacting standards was the Packard Bell television set manufacturing business, and it is interesting to see how he and Roberts handled this rare underperforming business unit. When they realized that Packard Bell had a permanent competitive disadvantage relative to its lower-cost Japanese competitors and could no longer earn acceptable returns, they immediately closed it, becoming the first American manufacturer to exit the industry. All the others followed over the next decade. The net result of these initiatives was that, starting in 1970, the company generated remarkably consistent profitability across a wide variety of market conditions. This influx of cash was sent to headquarters to be allocated by Singleton. The decisions he made in deploying this capital were, not surprisingly, highly unusual and effective. In early 1972, with his cash balance growing and acquisition multiples still high, Singleton placed a call from a midtown Manhattan phone booth to one of his board members, the legendary venture capitalist Arthur Rock, who would later back both Apple and Intel. Singleton began, "Arthur, I've been thinking about it and our stock is simply too cheap. I think we can earn a better return buying our shares at these levels than by doing almost anything else. I'd like to announce a tender. What do you think?" Rock reflected a moment and said, "I like it." With those words, one of the seminal moments in the history of capital allocation was launched. Starting with that 1972 tender and continuing for the next 12 years, Singleton went on an unprecedented share repurchasing spree that had a galvanic effect on Teledyne's stock price, while also almost single-handedly overturning long-held Wall Street beliefs. To say Singleton was a pioneer in the field of share repurchases is to dramatically understate the case. It is perhaps more accurate to describe him as the Babe Ruth of repurchases, the towering Olympian figure from the early history of this branch of corporate finance. Prior to the early 1970s, stock buybacks were uncommon and controversial. The conventional wisdom was that repurchases signaled a lack of internal investment opportunity, and they were thus regarded by Wall Street as a sign of weakness. Singleton ignored this orthodoxy, and between 1972 and 1984, in 8 separate tender offers, he bought back an astonishing 90% of Teledyne's outstanding shares. As Munger says, "No one has ever bought in shares as aggressively." Singleton believed repurchases were a far more tax-efficient method for returning capital to shareholders than dividends, which for most of his tenure were taxed at very high rates. Singleton believed buying stock at attractive prices was self-catalyzing, analogous to coiling a spring that at some future point would surge forward to realize full value, generating exceptional returns in the process. These repurchases provided a useful capital allocation benchmark, and whenever the return from purchasing his stock looked attractive relative to other investment opportunities, Singleton tendered for his shares. Repurchases became popular in the 1990s and have frequently been used by CEOs in recent years to prop up sagging stock prices. Buybacks, however, add value for shareholders only if they are made at attractive prices. Not surprisingly, Singleton bought extremely well, generating an incredible 42% compound annual return for Teledyne's shareholders across the tenders. These tender offers were in almost every case oversubscribed. Singleton had done the analysis and knew these buybacks were compelling, and with the strength of his conviction always bought all shares offered. These repurchases were very large bets for Teledyne, ranging in size from 4% to an unbelievable 66% of the company's book value at the time they were announced. In all, Singleton spent an incredible $2.5 billion on the buybacks. Table 2.2 puts this achievement in perspective. From 1971 to 1984, Singleton bought back huge chunks of Teledyne stock at low PEs, while revenues and net income continued to grow, resulting in an astonishing 40-fold increase in earnings per share. It's important, however, to recognize that this obsession with repurchases represented an evolution in thinking for Singleton, who, earlier in his career when he was building Teledyne, had been an active and highly effective issuer of stock. Great investors and capital allocators must be able to both sell high and buy low. The average price-to-earnings ratio for Teledyne's stock issuances was over 25. In contrast, the average multiple for his repurchases was under 8. Singleton had been fascinated by the stock market since his teens. George Roberts told me a story of Singleton on leave in New York during World War II, standing at the window of a brokerage firm for hours, watching the scroll of stock prices go by on ticker tape. In the mid-1970s, Singleton finally had an opportunity to act on this lifelong fascination when he assumed direct responsibility for investing the stock portfolios at Teledyne's insurance subsidiaries during a severe bear market, with P/E ratios at their lowest levels since the Depression. In the area of portfolio management, as with acquisitions, operations, and repurchases, Singleton developed an idiosyncratic approach with excellent results. In a significant contrarian move, he aggressively reallocated the assets in these insurance portfolios, increasing the total equity allocation from 10% in 1975 to a remarkable 77% by 1981. Singleton's approach to implementing this dramatic portfolio shift was even more unusual. He invested over 70% of the combined equity portfolios in just 5 companies, with an incredible 25% allocated to one company, his former employer, Litton Industries. This extraordinary portfolio concentration, a typical mutual fund owns over 100 stocks, caused consternation on Wall Street, where many observers thought Singleton was preparing for a new round of acquisitions. Singleton had no such intention, but it is instructive to look more closely at how he invested these portfolios. His top holdings were invariably companies he knew well, including smaller conglomerates like Curtiss-Wright and large energy and insurance companies like Texaco and Aetna, whose P/E ratios were at or near record lows at the time of his investment. As Charlie Munger said of Singleton's investment approach, "Like Warren and me, he was comfortable with concentration and bought only a few things that he understood well." As with his repurchases of Teledyne stock, Singleton's returns in these insurance portfolios were excellent. A proxy for these returns can be seen in Figure 2.1, which shows the approximately 8-fold growth in book value at Teledyne's insurance subsidiaries from 1975 through 1985, when Singleton began the process of dismantling his company. During the period from 1984 to 1996, Singleton shifted his focus from portfolio management to management succession. In 1986, he tapped Roberts to succeed him as CEO, retaining the chairman's title, and to optimizing shareholder value in the face of stagnating results at Teledyne's operating divisions. To accomplish these objectives, Singleton resorted to new tactics, again confounding Wall Street. Singleton was a pioneer in the use of spin-offs, which he believed would both simplify succession issues at Teledyne by reducing the company's complexity and unlock the full value of the company's large insurance operations for shareholders. In the words of longtime board member Fayez Sarafim, Singleton believed there was a time to conglomerate and a time to deconglomerate. The time for deconglomeration finally arrived in 1986 with the debut spin-off of Argonaut, the company's workers' compensation insurer. Next, in 1990, Singleton spun off Unitrin, the company's largest insurance operation, with Jerry Jerome as CEO. This was a significant move, as Unitrin accounted for the majority of Teledyne's enterprise value at that time. It has had excellent returns since going public under the leadership of Jerome and his successor, Dick Vai. Starting in the mid to late 1980s, Teledyne's non-insurance operations slowed in the face of a cyclical downturn in the energy and specialty metals markets and fraud charges at its defense business. In 1987, at a time when both acquisition and stock prices, including his own, were at historic highs, Singleton concluded that he had no better, higher-returning options for deploying the company's cash flow, and declared the company's first dividend in 26 years as a public company. This was a seismic event for longtime Teledyne observers, signaling the arrival of a new phase in the company's history. After these successful spin-offs and with Roberts established in the CEO role, Singleton retired as chairman in 1991 to focus on his extensive cattle ranching operations. Ranching held a singular appeal for Singleton, as it did for many successful Texas-born entrepreneurs of his generation, and he would eventually acquire over 1 million acres of ranch land across New Mexico, Arizona, and California. He returned, however, in 1996 to personally negotiate the merger of Teledyne's remaining manufacturing operations with Allegheny Industries and fend off a hostile takeover bid by raider Bennett LeBeau. In these negotiations, according to Bill Rutledge, Teledyne's president at the time, Singleton focused exclusively on getting the best possible price, ignoring other peripheral issues such as management titles and board composition. Again, the outcome was a favorable one for Teledyne shareholders, a 30% premium to the company's prior trading price. Singleton left behind an extraordinary record, dwarfing both his peers and the market. From 1963, the first year for which we have reliable stock data, to 1990, when he stepped down as chairman, Singleton delivered a remarkable 20.4% compound annual return to his shareholders, including spin-offs, compared to an 8.0% return for the S&P 500 over the same period and an 11.6% return for other major conglomerate stocks. A dollar invested with Henry Singleton in 1963 would have been worth $180.94 by 1990, an almost 9-fold outperformance versus his peers and a more than 12-fold outperformance versus the S&P 500, leaving Jack Welch a distant speck in his rearview mirror. The nuts and bolts. One of the most important decisions any CEO makes is how he spends his time, specifically how much time he spends in 3 essential areas: management of operations, capital allocation, and investor relations. Henry Singleton's approach to time management was, not surprisingly, very different from peers like Tex Thornton and Harold Janine, and very similar to his fellow outsider CEOs. As he told Financial World magazine in 1978, "I don't reserve any day-to-day responsibilities for myself, so I don't get into any particular rut. I do not define my job in any rigid terms, but in terms of having the freedom to do whatever seems to be in the best interests of the company at any time." Singleton eschewed detailed strategic plans, preferring instead to retain flexibility and keep options open. As he once explained at a Teledyne annual meeting, "I know a lot of people have very strong and definite plans that they've worked out on all kinds of things, but we're subject to a tremendous number of outside influences, and the vast majority of them cannot be predicted. So my idea is to stay flexible." In a rare interview with a Businessweek reporter, he explained himself more simply. "My only plan is to keep coming to work. I like to steer the boat each day rather than plan ahead way into the future." Unlike conglomerate peers such as Thornton or Janine or Gulf and Western's colorful Charles Bluhdorn, Singleton did not court Wall Street analysts or the business press. In fact, he believed investor relations was an inefficient use of time and simply refused to provide quarterly earnings guidance or appear at industry conferences. This was highly unconventional behavior at a time when his more accommodating peers were often on the cover of the top business magazines. Teledyne versus Sarbanes-Oxley. Teledyne's iconoclasm extended to today's hot-button topic of corporate governance. The company's board would fail miserably by the current standards of Sarbanes-Oxley legislation. Singleton, like many of the CEOs in this audiobook, was a proponent of small boards. Teledyne's board consisted of only 6 directors, including Singleton, half of them insiders. It was an exceptionally talented group, however, and each member had a significant economic interest in the company. In addition to Singleton, Roberts, and Kosmetsky, who retired from Teledyne in 1966 to run the business school at the University of Texas, board members included Claude Shannon, Singleton's MIT classmate and the father of information theory, Arthur Rock, the legendary venture capitalist, and Fayez Sarafim, the billionaire Houston-based fund manager. This group collectively owned almost 40% of the company's stock by the end of the period. Even in an audiobook filled with CEOs who were aggressive in buying back stock, Singleton is in a league of his own. Given his voracious appetite for Teledyne's shares and the overall high levels of repurchases among the outsider CEOs, it's worth looking a little more closely at Singleton's approach to buybacks, which differed significantly from that of most CEOs today. Fundamentally, there are 2 basic approaches to buying back stock. In the most common contemporary approach, a company authorizes an amount of capital, usually a relatively small percentage of the excess cash on its balance sheet, for the repurchase of shares, and then gradually over a period of quarters, or sometimes years, buys in stock on the open market. This approach is careful, conservative, and, not coincidentally, unlikely to have any meaningful impact on long-term share values. Let's call this cautious, methodical approach the straw. The other approach, the one favored by the CEOs in this audiobook and pioneered by Singleton, is quite a bit bolder. This approach features less frequent and much larger repurchases timed to coincide with low stock prices, typically made within very short periods of time, often via tender offers, and occasionally funded with debt. Singleton, who employed this approach no fewer than 8 times, disdained the straw, preferring instead a suction hose. Singleton's 1980 share buyback provides an excellent example of his capital allocation acumen. In May of that year, with Teledyne's PE multiple near an all-time low, Singleton initiated the company's largest tender yet, which was oversubscribed by 3-fold. Singleton decided to buy all the tendered shares, over 20% of shares outstanding, and given the company's strong free cash flow and a recent drop in interest rates, financed the entire repurchase with fixed-rate debt. After the repurchase, interest rates rose sharply, and the price of the newly issued bonds fell. Singleton did not believe interest rates were likely to continue to rise, so he initiated a buyback of the bonds. He retired the bonds, however, with cash from the company's pension fund, which was not taxed on investment gains. As a result of this complex series of transactions, Teledyne successfully financed a large stock repurchase with inexpensive debt. The pension fund realized sizable tax-free gains on its bond purchase when interest rates subsequently fell, and, oh yes, the stock appreciated enormously, a 10-year compound return of over 40%. Singleton's fierce independence of mind remained a prominent trait until the end of his life. In 1997, 2 years before his death from brain cancer at age 82, he sat down with Leon Cooperman, a longtime Teledyne investor. At the time, a number of Fortune 500 companies had recently announced large share repurchases. When Cooperman asked him about them, Singleton responded presciently, "If everyone's doing them, there must be something wrong with them." Buffett and Singleton, separated at birth? Many of the distinctive tenets of Warren Buffett's unique approach to managing Berkshire Hathaway were first employed by Singleton at Teledyne. In fact, Singleton can be seen as a sort of proto-Buffett, and there are uncanny similarities between these two virtuoso CEOs, as the following list demonstrates. The CEO as investor. Both Buffett and Singleton designed organizations that allowed them to focus on capital allocation, not operations. Both viewed themselves primarily as investors, not managers. Decentralized operations, centralized investment decisions. Both ran highly decentralized organizations with very few employees at corporate, and few, if any, intervening layers between operating companies and top management. Both made all major capital allocation decisions for their companies. Investment philosophy. Both Buffett and Singleton focused their investments in industries they knew well and were comfortable with concentrated portfolios of public securities. Approach to investor relations. Neither offered quarterly guidance to analysts or attended conferences. Both provided informative annual reports with detailed business unit information. Dividends. Teledyne, alone among conglomerates, didn't pay a dividend for its first 26 years. Berkshire has never paid a dividend. Stock splits. Teledyne was the highest-priced issue on the NYSE for much of the 1970s and 1980s. Buffett has never split Berkshire's A shares, which now trade at over $120,000 a share. Significant CEO ownership. Both Singleton and Buffett had significant ownership stakes in their companies, 13% for Singleton and 30+% for Buffett. They thought like owners because they were owners. Insurance subsidiaries. Both Singleton and Buffett recognized the potential to invest insurance company float to create shareholder value, and for both companies, insurance was the largest and most important business. The restaurant analogy. Phil Fisher, a famous investor, once compared companies to restaurants. Over time, through a combination of policies and decisions, analogous to cuisine, prices, and ambiance, they self-select for a certain clientele. By this standard, both Buffett and Singleton intentionally ran highly unusual restaurants that over time attracted like-minded, long-term oriented customer/shareholders. Chapter 3. The Turnaround. Bill Anders and General Dynamics. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Ralph Waldo Emerson. In 1989, after nearly 30 years as the international symbol of Cold War tension and anxiety, the Berlin Wall came down, and, with its fall, the U.S. defense industry's longtime business model also crumbled. The industry had traditionally relied on selling the large weapons systems, missiles, bombers, and so forth, that were the backbone of U.S. post-World War II military strategy. As the decades-long policy of Soviet containment became seemingly obsolete overnight, the industry was thrust into turmoil. Long seen as a cozy fraternity of former generals and admirals, the industry's leading executives scrambled to redefine their companies. Within 6 months of the wall's demise, an index of the leading publicly traded defense companies had fallen 40%. One company seemed particularly poorly positioned. General Dynamics had been a pioneer in the defense industry. The company traced its roots back to the late 19th century and had a long history selling major weapons to the Pentagon, including aircraft, both the legendary B-29 bomber during World War II and the F-16 fighter plane, workhorse of the modern Air Force, ships, as the leading manufacturer of submarines, and land vehicles, as the leading supplier of tanks and other combat vehicles. Over the years, the company had diversified into missiles and space systems and a number of non-defense businesses, including Cessna commercial planes and building supplies. General Dynamics had been racked by scandal in the 1980s, as federal investigators discovered abuse of company planes and other perquisites by top executives. In 1986, the company brought in a new CEO, Stan Pace, with an excellent reputation at the Pentagon. Pace improved relations with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but operations stagnated, and in 1990 the company learned of the potential cancellation of its largest new aircraft program, the A-12. When a new CEO took over in January 1991, General Dynamics had $600 million of debt and negative cash flow, and faced conjecture about a possible bankruptcy. The company had revenues of $10 billion and a market capitalization of just $1 billion. In the words of Goldman Sachs' defense analyst Judy Bollinger, the company was the lowest of the low, the worst-positioned company in a declining industry. In other words, this was a turnaround. Companies in financial distress often hire restructuring consultants who helicopter in, slash costs, negotiate with lenders and suppliers, and look to sell the company as quickly as possible before moving on to the next assignment. These hired guns tend to ignore longer-term considerations like culture, capital investment, and organizational structure, focusing instead on short-term cash needs. Turnarounds often succeed in generating attractive near-term returns, usually concluding with the sale of the business to a larger company, a process that has been likened to taking the last puffs from a cigar butt. It is unusual for a turnaround to sustain high returns over long periods of time and across multiple CEOs, which is exactly what happened at General Dynamics. The General Dynamics story shows how the key elements of the approach used by the outsider CEOs can be effective even in situations of significant industry dislocation. It all began when Bill Anders assumed the helm at General Dynamics in January 1991, at the depth of the early 1990s post-Gulf War bear market. Anders was definitely not your garden-variety CEO. He had had a remarkably distinguished, if unconventional, career before he joined General Dynamics, graduating with an electrical engineering degree from the Naval Academy in 1955 and serving as an Air Force fighter pilot during the Cold War. He earned an advanced degree in nuclear engineering in 1963 and was one of only 14 men chosen from a pool of thousands to join NASA's elite astronaut corps. As the lunar module pilot on the 1968 Apollo 8 mission, Anders took the now iconic Earthrise photograph, which eventually appeared on the covers of Time, Life, and American Photography. A leading defense analyst believes these early accomplishments gave Anders the ability to take risks in later pursuits. After orbiting the moon, mundane business problems did not faze him. He left NASA with the rank of Major General and was named the first chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission before serving a brief stint as ambassador to Norway, all before the age of 45. He was well known and respected at the Pentagon and after leaving the public sector, he joined General Electric, where he trained in the GE management approach and was a contemporary of Jack Welch's. As he says, there was a terrific group of GE managers who were excellent swimming instructors, although they occasionally tried to drown you. Anders was eventually hired in 1984 to run the commercial operations of pioneering conglomerate Textron Corporation, an experience he found frustrating. He had an independent, contrarian personality and a direct-to-the-point-of-bluntness communications style. Not impressed with Textron's eclectic mix of generally mediocre businesses and bureaucratic corporate structure, he, not surprisingly, clashed with Textron's incumbent CEO. In 1989, he met a senior General Dynamics executive at a trade association meeting, and when offered the chance to join the company as vice chairman for a year and then move into the CEO slot, he leapt at the opportunity. He spent that interim period getting to know the company's businesses and culture and studying, with the assistance of Bain & Company, the massive changes roiling the industry as the era of lofty defense spending came to a seemingly abrupt halt. This year of study enabled him to hit the ground running when he was formally named CEO. Although he is the oldest CEO in this audiobook and the only one to take the helm in his 50s, Anders had only 10 years of private sector experience when he accepted the General Dynamics post, and his eyes were still very fresh. The defense industry, traditionally run by engineers and retired military brass, had something of the feel of a club or fraternity. Anders, both an engineer and a former general, was uniquely positioned to take a broom to the industry's cobwebs, and his conclusions and subsequent actions would shake the cozy defense community to its core. His turnaround strategy for General Dynamics was rooted in a central strategic insight. The defense industry had significant excess capacity following the end of the Cold War. As a result, Anders believed industry players needed to move aggressively to either shrink their businesses or grow through acquisition. In this new environment, there would be consolidators and consolidatees, and companies needed to figure out quickly which camp they belonged in. Anders outlined his strategy in his initial annual and quarterly reports and proceeded to aggressively implement it. This strategy rested on 3 key tenets. 1. Anders, borrowing a page from his former GE colleague Welch, believed General Dynamics should only be in business where it had the number 1 or number 2 market position. This was strikingly similar to the Powell Doctrine of the same era, which called for the United States to only enter military conflicts that it could win decisively. 2. The company would exit commodity businesses where returns were unacceptably low. 3. It would stick to businesses it knew well. Specifically, it would be wary of commercial businesses, long and elusive holy grail-like source of new profits for defense companies. The company would exit businesses that did not meet these strategic criteria. Additionally, Anders believed that General Dynamics needed dramatic cultural change. As he conducted thorough interviews with top executives prior to becoming CEO, he found a deeply ingrained engineering mindset with a relentless focus on the development of larger, faster, more lethal weapons and little concern for shareholders, a stark contrast with GE. Anders moved aggressively to correct this focus and instill an emphasis on shareholders and on metrics like return on equity. He also believed that operations would need to be significantly streamlined to optimize returns. To accomplish this, he needed a new team, and he moved quickly to put one in place. His first step was to elevate Jim Mellor to President and Chief Operating Officer. Mellor had run General Dynamics' shipbuilding business with excellent results, and as Anders told me, he was the kind of guy that would look for the last nickel and hold people responsible. Together, in the first half of 1991, Anders and Mellor replaced 21 of the company's top 25 executives. In addition to new operating talent, Anders brought on Harvey Kapnick, a financial wizard, as vice chairman, and he began to rely on a talented lawyer, Nick Chabraya, to help with a variety of legal and strategic tasks relating to the turnaround. Once he had his team in place, he wasted little time in implementing an extraordinary restructuring. The Anders years, only 3 in total, can be divided into 2 basic phases, the generating of cash and its deployment. In each phase, the company's approach was highly idiosyncratic. Let's start with cash generation. When Anders and Mellor began to implement their plan, General Dynamics was over-leveraged and had negative cash flow. Over the ensuing 3 years, the company would generate $5 billion of cash. There were two basic sources of this astonishing influx: a remarkable tightening of operations and the sale of businesses